Good Monday morning and happy Memorial Day. I'm hoping you're enjoying perhaps a day off and a day to reflect and to remember. Memorial Day is good for that. But that's not so much what I've been musing about this past week. This is really a overabundance of things that I've been thinking about related to talking about Wesley and talking about the uses of money. In that, musing from a couple of weeks ago and thinking and researching for that, it was interesting to me that John Calvin was the first major theologian, really, in about 1,500 years, to say that interest on loans makes some sort of sense. In the Lord's Prayer, we hear, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So that in the very common prayer that Jesus taught his disciples and the church has repeated for thousands of years, on some sort of level, thinking about debts, being indebted, and the forgiveness of debts, it's right there in the very first prayer, the thing that's said in churches across the world every Sunday. So isn't it interesting that at Woods we've understood debts to mean sins? Or perhaps you grew up in a tradition where you said trespasses. How we think about the use of money, how money is accumulated, how money is created, how debts are accumulated and forgiven is something that the church has been interested in for a long, long time. And again, it's interesting to me that Calvin would be the first theologian to say that interest on loans was something that the church should understand, appreciate, and use even to its own benefit. This comes in the face of years and years and years of prohibitions against what's called usury, the idea of, on the one hand, exorbitant interest rates, where we'd say the loans are predatory, but perhaps it means any interest at all. In Acts 2, we hear the story of the early church at Pentecost, fresh in our minds, I hope, where the church was formed, and there by Acts 2, I think about verse 37, we hear that everyone gave from their abilities, each according to people's needs. And so how do we put these things together? How do we put the forgiveness of debt, the charging of interest, the uses of money, how do those come together for us in thinking about the society in which we live, where people have mortgages? I know I have mine. Do you have yours? People have auto loans, credit cards, frequent flyer miles. How might all these things be used in one way or another for the glory of God and the common good? That's Calvin's primary driving point. How do we understand how these things are used for the common good? You also might be aware of something called the Protestant work ethic. That was a book title by a German sociologist named Max Weber, or Weber, depending on your pronunciation. And in that book, he said that the Protestant work ethic is connected to the spirit of capitalism. Where? Specifically among the Calvinists. So how we get there, what did Calvin say to make us work so hard and feel that we need to have just a little bit extra to the point that we might be saving and earning interest? Those are the things I've been musing about this week. How has interest served you in your savings accounts or your investments? And where do we think of charging interest on those who struggle to pay them as a part of the fabric of society, things that create money and the things that laden people with social and financial pressure that they're not able to overcome? What's the role of charity there? These are big questions, and I think that some of the things that Calvin said early on might help us to think about those on one hand in the ways that things exist now, and on the other hand in the ways that Calvin might have imagined them all the way back in the 16th century. So that's what I've been musing on, researching on, and I think there's a lot of interesting things to share. So if you have a little extra time, I know that time is money, but if you have some of it, won't you stick around and listen? Whether we're talking about trespasses or debts or sins, all of those terms in the Lord's Prayer make us think about economics in one way or another. What do we trespass upon? We trespass on land that's owned privately by a family or something like that. So forgive us our trespasses has some sense of private property that comes along with it. Forgive us our debts if we're talking about grain or mint or dill or cumin or something like that in the ancient world. Those are things that could be credited and debited to families in the ancient world. Maybe coins too. We know that by the time of Jesus, Judas was the treasurer, and there were 30 pieces of silver that had an important role to play in the life of Jesus, or the death of Jesus, maybe we should say. So trespasses, debts, sins, all of these have some notion of private property in the life of Jesus. That was the milieu in which he worked. So how are Christians today supposed to think about private property when that Pentecost prayer, that story of the early church where they sold all that they had, Ananias and Sapphira were supposed to sell a field and give those proceeds to that early church? How do we hold these things together? And how does any of that have to do with the 15 point whatever percent APR that you have on your credit card? How does that story, that horizon, the prayer for the forgiveness of debts and trespasses connect us to the ways that we use money even today? Calvin is an interesting figure because he grounds things not in the biblical law or the divine law. As a person of his time, he wants to say that the society that we have, fallen and tainted as it is by sin, because Calvin says that a lot, wants to note that these things are based not only in divine law, but they're also rooted in natural law. How does he come to that conclusion? In his commentary on Genesis 2, he says that we are social animals, that it is not the case that God has created us as isolated individuals, independent from one another. Eve is created as a suitable helper, and God creates a multitude of peoples in order that we're able to share our gifts. On this note, Calvin sounds an awful lot like Plato. If we were to form a republic, maybe it's the case that I'm especially good at carving axe handles, and you're able to carve axe wedges. If we work together, we produce more axes together. If I had to do both the handle and the axe head, then I'm limited in my time, and the common good, society overall, heaven forbid, has a shortage of axes, and so what are we to do? That's Plato, not Calvin, for whatever that's worth. So Calvin says that we should not work only to meet our own needs. We should work for the common good and the good of our neighbor. That's what surplus allows us to do. And it's on that notion of surplus that Calvin puts in the minds of his followers that there are markets for what we do, that we should overproduce. We should not only be concerned about our needs, but the needs of society at large. That's why, in one sense, I might be able to stop with just one, maybe, if I'm luxurious, 2 axes. My neighbor might need one, and so it is part of the natural order of things that I would create in my business as many axe handles or axe heads as I possibly could. In that model, Max Weber, writing in the 19th century and early 20th century, says Calvin spurs something up in society where we can talk about growth, and in the notion of growth, we're able to think about how we are able to care for more people based on the more we produce. And by the time Weber is writing, that becomes not just in the practical things like the amount of grain grown by farmers. For Weber, it's financial at that point. Weber's trying to look back into history and name the present time where, because of this Protestant work ethic, where in our work we're trying to earn more than we need for the sake of our neighbors and the common good, we want more surplus, because what we're doing is not only for our neighbors, our work is labor given to God. And he names the Calvinists specifically as the people who spurred that notion on. So, Max Weber, the Protestant work ethic, and the spirit of capitalism, he connects them right together. Calvin, recognizing that the world was fallen, said that in our loans to one another, we assume risk. And this maybe sounds to you like Adam Smith if you remember back to your economics classes whenever you might have read The Wealth of Nations or something like that. Why should a person be able to charge interest? If I give you $100, why should I expect 105 or 110 back? Because in giving you $100, I am at risk for myself. There's an opportunity cost that I'm losing, and if you lose the money in bad endeavoring, then I should be somehow compensated, and for the risk that I am taking in lending you money, some amount of interest would be warranted. That's Adam Smith a little more than John Calvin, but Calvin says that those charges on interest encourage our charitable giving, with the caveat that the person receiving the loan should be able to profit more than the lender. Aren't you so glad that you listened to my musing today, Monday? Welcome to Jacob's Economics 101. If I'm boring you, I apologize. But if it's any consolation, it's on this notion that Christians need to speak loudly and largely that the overriding message of the gospel is one where debts are forgiven and repaid. That the common good that we seek encourages good not just for our own well-being, but because we are social animals, the thing that started Calvin on this trajectory in the first place says that we need to be concerned about the good of our neighbors. So whether we're making personal loans or we're aware of the ways that our money in a bank is loaned out to other people, we should be concerned about this old notion of usury or debt relief. It's a wonderful thing if money is created by lending, but it's also a terrible thing if people are so overburdened by debt that their ability to pursue other endeavoring, other enjoyment, say a change in careers for the sake of fulfillment or for the sake of higher earnings, something we talked about a couple of weeks ago. What a terrible thing if debt is the oppressive thing that keeps them from doing that. And so that's where I want to make kind of my final point for today. If it's Memorial Day, if you're sitting out in the sun, I'm not sure Economics 101 from Jacob is what you're looking for. But how we understand the use of our money is incredibly important. There is a church in Annapolis, following some other churches, that said we could buy up people's medical debt, recognizing that lenders are seeking to earn their money back as best they can, even if it's not every penny of a loan. Once they're at over 100% of their principal, then they're making money one way or another. So that church bought outstanding debt, reduced it, and paid it off. That's what allowed them to buy over $1 million worth of medical debt and pay it off with about $100,000. What a wonderful thing for a church to do. That relieves its own members and people in its community of those overbearing $1 million debts, and allows them to start to do other things, whether those are investment in education, home improvement, new cars so that they can get to work, starting small businesses, buying things that they need for their kids and their families, whatever the case may be. Debt is the thing that keeps people from spending or investing in other ways. And a church just in Annapolis was able to do that. However we're able to relieve the burden of debt, we should recognize that we're trying to seek what's good, not just for ourselves, but for our neighbors. The overwhelming amount of medical debt and student loans that exist in the country are very high. They hinder people's ability to get married when they want, to buy a house when they want, or to start a family when they want, because they simply don't have the funds for it. So if the church is supposed to be concerned about people's health, as Jesus clearly indicates, if it's supposed to be concerned about education, which I would advocate for, and if it's supposed to be for families, then the ways we think about how debt slows down that process for families or hinders families from doing that, people from doing that, there's something that the church can do. And the first thing it can do is recognize how the use of our money, the expenses that we have or try to cut out of our lives, the charitable giving that we do, and that work ethic that allows us to have more than we need so that we might share it. All of these things are things that we need to keep in mind. A lot of that was said by Luther. Some of that might be intuitive or make a lot of sense from the Bible. But here's the one caveat that I want you to think about a little bit. Why does Calvin encourage a small interest amount? Why does he do away with that distinction about usury being any interest on loans? There's an interesting history of banking where Jews, Christians, and Muslims all were in some agreement, at least up to Calvin, that they should not lend at interest, at least for themselves. But a Jewish banker's ability to charge interest on a Christian or on a Muslim allowed Jews to start in banking. The same for Christians, so that they could give loans to Muslims and Jews. Muslims could give to Jews and Christians. The idea that they're earning back for their own private community was something that spurred on investments. Because Calvin was concerned about the welfare of Geneva, he said that this is simply the cost of doing business, and it spurred people on, that a small interest rate was a way of encouraging investment and encouraging lending so that the city was able to do better than it otherwise would. How do we think about that in terms of taxes and interest and the role of business, that Protestant work ethic that Weber wanted to talk about? Is this a lesser of two evils? Is this a part of fallenness that Calvin just comes to grips with and says, well, that's what we have to do because it's the world that we live in? Or is there something else at stake, where he thinks kind of along the lines of Adam Smith, that people who lend should be rewarded in some ways for the risk that they take, so that if 9 out of 10 people return their debts, they're still able to loan out again, as opposed to all of their money disappearing. That's something worth thinking about, because I like that Calvin encourages the so-called Protestant work ethic. The idea that we're working not just for our own benefit, but for the good of society. And with that comes some complexity. Maybe a small interest rate. Maybe a reason for Christians to be involved in government or in banking, things that the church was not so high on before Calvin. Thinking about these roles and the ways that churches are able to have money endowments, the ways that universities or schools are able to work for a profit, these are touchy, tricky subjects. And on the one hand, we can say it's overdone, it's predatory, and doesn't Jesus tell us to work for the relief of debt? Calvin says we can do that, but we can also have win-win situations where a small amount of interest, as long as it works out to the benefit of the person receiving the loan rather than the lender, is worth considering. I don't know if you followed any of this or if you care about any of this, but it is what I've been musing about this past week. Calvin has an extensive and interesting theology about how to run a city, because unlike Luther and theologians before him, Calvin was also a city manager. It was largely the Calvinists in Switzerland who came up with the idea of what we would call little r republicanism, representation in the modern world. It had been dormant from the days of Rome for a long, long time. So how we understand those governmental workings, those systemic workings, and the Protestant work ethic behind it is something that I've been interested in. And so now I have the pleasure of musing about it with you. Whether or not it's a pleasure for you to listen to this stuff, well, that's for you to decide. I'm grateful for your time and attention, and I will go on to different topics next week. See you next Monday.